And for more on the significance of Putin's annual news conference, let's go to New York City. We're joined by Lincoln Mitchell. He's a national political correspondent at the New York Observer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, President Putin didn't really hold back, to say the least, when discussing Turkey, really striking out verbally. What did you make of his comments, especially the no prospect of improving ties with Turkey?
Well, he came out very hard-hitting against Turkey. First thing to keep in mind for me is that this is aimed at domestic Russian audiences, for whom Putin wants to present himself as a tough guy, the defender, rebuilding Russian strength in the world, rebuilding Russia's position in the world. That's the purpose of this speech. It's for the Russian domestic audience. Secondly, although he said he wasn't saber-rattling, of course he was saber-rattling. And Turkey isn't just some country in the middle of nowhere. Turkey is a member of NATO. So to make implicit threats to a NATO member country and even is a very serious thing, and it is not something that is going to strengthen the relationship with Europe or the United States or the other NATO members. So this was, I think, a very aggressive position taken by Putin, and we should understand that as such.
Regarding Syria, something else that was discussed, we know that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry this week met with President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Do you think this relationship is softening somewhat? We know that there's going to be a big meeting Friday there in New York City, this international meeting on Syria. What can we expect there?
Well, it may or may not be softening, but something important happened this week in Moscow, which is that the Secretary of State during that meeting and the Russian leadership agreed that the United States was going to back away a little bit from what's been its long-standing position that Assad must go. And at least in the short run, that's clearly a victory for Moscow. Moscow's position here is Assad must stay. That's not what Putin said, but that's been their position. They're in Syria to prop up their client, and their client is Assad. So the U.S. has backed away from its hardline anti-Assad position, and meaning that there is some room for negotiation here. The problem the U.S. faces with its relationship with Russia is that the U.S. is trying to do three things. It's trying to oust Assad from power. It's trying to destroy ISIS in Syria and the region, and it's trying to contain Russia. Any one of those three tasks would be a very, very difficult task. Right now, the United States is trying to do all three, and something has to give. And the first thing that gave was the commitment to oust Assad.
Well, do you think we could see something come out of this meeting tomorrow or down the line regarding Syria? We did see the United States and Russia work together regarding the Iran nuclear deal. Can we expect something more?
Well, perhaps we could see a situation where Russia and the United States work together to destroy ISIS, because that is in both of their interests. That's not the extent of both of their interests, but that is in both of their interests. However, I would caution that if we look at the last, 5 or 10 years, more often than not, we see that it's very difficult to cooperate with Russia. You know, if you look at going back even to Georgia in 2008, agreements that Russia makes aren't kept. So I would be very wary. Any administration should be very wary about assuming that we can now cooperate well with Moscow.
Lincoln, we have about a minute left. Just quickly, your thoughts into Putin's comments that there are some Russian troops inside Ukraine despite previous denials. Your thoughts on this revelation, if you will?
Well, of course, there have been many Russian troops inside of Ukraine for well over a year now. To me, this is significant because Putin saying that, he has said that because he has essentially won in Ukraine. No one is talking about taking Crimea back from Russia. No one is really even talking about Ukraine at all. So I think that's evidence that Putin feels like he can talk about this more because he's kind of won. And that's a very damaging thing for Ukraine.
All right. Lincoln Mitchell, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate you joining us from New York City.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.